political panel. First, I'm not sure what order they're going in, but Jim Kolbe is a former member of the House of Representatives, and he's currently a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund, and importantly, he is a member of the Peterson-Pew Commission on Budget Reform and a member of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Clive Crook is an editor at the Atlantic Monthly and a columnist for the National Journey, and a commentator for the Financial Times. Norm Ornstein, columnist for Roll Call, well-known observer of the political scene, and he's the co-director of the AEI Brookings Election Reform Project. Jamal Simmons is a principal of the Raben Group, Raben Group, and he has vast experience as both a commentator, a political consultant, and a pundit. And I just have to tell you that as a good friend of mine, Jamal was somebody we went to graduate school together. And every time I raised my hand to make a comment, Jamal raised his hand before he had heard what I was going to say to disagree. So I'm going to use my position as moderator today and disagree with everything Jamal says to keep the discussion lively. So what I've asked our panelists today is to comment on the political environment, and if they have any constructive ideas to how to improve it, that would be welcome. I think that may be above just about everybody's pay grade right now, but perhaps we'll come up with some interesting ideas. So Clive, we'll start with you.
Okay. Well, I have just a few brief comments on this. I want to respond to things that have been said in the earlier panel, put them in something more of a political context. The way I think about the politics of the issue is really boils down to this: is the country scared enough yet to do something about this problem? And the answer is no, plainly no. And let me give you some indications, some signs of why I think that's the case, some tests of how complacent the country still is about the problem. There's still a big, wide strand of influential opinion out there, maybe not in this room, but out there, that says we shouldn't be worrying about the deficit. We shouldn't be worrying so much about the debt. That the first order of business is to stimulate the economy again and mitigate the present recession. We'll deal with the debt problem later. I mean, there's something to be said for that view, but it's a sign that we aren't yet concerned about the long-term picture, or we aren't concerned enough about it. In my view, there's a linkage between short-term stimulus and long-term consolidation, both in the politics and the economics. It seems to me that a credible commitment to long-term fiscal consolidation, to long-term fiscal prudence, would actually assist on the short-term stimulus front. But this connection has not been made in the debate that's going on out there. I see that point made hardly ever. The point is far more, do we need more stimulus? If we do, then put long-term debt concerns to one side. I think that's a sign of that we aren't taking the problem seriously enough. I want to respond to something Bob Reichauer said with all due respect. I mean, I've admired Robert Reichauer's work for years, and of course he's on the right side in this debate, but I was very struck by his answer to the question from the floor: how do you grade the Obama budget? B minus. B minus? I mean, he went through, I thought, an excellent analysis of what we need to do to solve this problem. Frame public opinion correctly, state a clear goal, set benchmarks, create a mechanism, enforcement. Six items, all of which are necessary. Obama's budget didn't make progress on any of them. Arguably, you could say, it set a goal, but I would prefer to say it paid lip service to the need to stabilize the debt ratio at some level, at some point. But the rest of it is zero. So how can you grade a budget like that B minus if you take long-term debt seriously? And maybe Bob will respond to this later, but my submission is that it's simply that Bob isn't actually that worried yet. If we were scared, if we thought that really strong action were needed now, nobody would be saying the budget that Obama just introduced was a B minus. We're talking about deficits, especially in DC, And all credit to the Peterson Foundation for pushing this subject in front of people. But we aren't talking about how to solve it. There's very little conversation, it seems to me, in the country about, serious conversation, about spending cuts or tax increases. And this, this in effect is a kind of deference to public opinion, because that is where the public is. The public is concerned about borrowing. The public says it's concerned about public debt, but not concerned enough to contemplate serious entitlement reform, not concerned enough to talk about tax increases. Look at the failure recently, a couple of the people have already mentioned this, to establish a statutory fiscal commission, which seems to me, in present circumstances, almost a minimal step. Politics trumped that initiative. Senate Republicans, who were co-sponsors of the legislation, voted against it on the basis of what I take to be probably a wise political calculation. There aren't votes in this yet. And the bottom line, maybe this is the best litmus test of all, is anyone out there calling for the administration, calling for the president to break his promise on taxes? I don't hear a voice. Maybe there are a couple. But who is demanding that the circumstances have changed and Obama should no longer try to keep his promise not to raise taxes except on the rich? That view simply isn't being expressed, and I think the conventional wisdom in political circles in Washington would be for Obama to adopt that position, that we need to rethink that, would be political suicide. Well, if it would be political suicide, that's just another way of saying we aren't scared enough yet. Just a couple of other very quick points. Can we solve the problem? Can we get to a solution without really fundamental reforms? Instinctively, I'm inclined to say, yes, that these problems can be solved without big bang solutions. And that's certainly what happened in the 90s. But one wonders, when one looks at the numbers, takes seriously the numbers in CBO analysis and the work that the Peterson Foundation has just published, you really have to wonder whether this time that's going to work. The gap is so big and the prospects for growth so poor or so disappointing compared with what we saw in the 90s, that it's hard to believe that we can do this without fundamental measures. So, I think there is ground for pessimism there. We do need comprehensive entitlement reform, married to, I think, comprehensive tax reform. Otherwise, we aren't going to solve this problem before it hits us in the face. And I don't see the conversation on those two things even beginning. One last observation. Despite my carefully cultivated American accent, you've probably, one or two of you may have guessed that I'm a Brit. And I do look at this situation somewhat from a European perspective. When you look at the long-term budget numbers, it does seem to me that the US is taking a step towards European levels of social provision. It's hesitant and it isn't explicit, but I think if you look at the permanent increase in discretionary spending in the budget, it sort of points you in that direction. This is where the country, in many ways, wants to go. There is an appetite for healthcare reform. There is an appetite for universal health insurance. These are, there is a mood that says we need to do more. We need to move towards the European model in some of these areas. But where is the corresponding appetite for European levels of taxation? Seems to me that is one of the underlying problems that the US faces, that the country's appetite for public spending is now running ahead of its appetite for taxes. And I think you have to add that political problem to all the other problems, all the other obstacles that we've heard about that militate against tackling the issue. And I want to emphasize just one, which increasingly strikes me as important. And that is the way that the US tax system, the income tax system, has been over the years, well, since the last big reform in the 1980s, so comprehensively hollowed out. And I think actually a lot of the country's fiscal problems relate to this on healthcare and on other issues. But one big thing is that the constituency for spending discipline has been seriously undermined. More than 40% of the country does not pay any income tax. That is a startling figure. What interest does that 40% of the country have in spending discipline? 40% of the country understands that any new spending initiatives are going to be paid for by other people. This seems to me a sort of quasi-constitutional issue that is going to need to be addressed as part of comprehensive tax reform. And it inclines me to suggest that the US needs to take very seriously the idea of a VAT. A VAT is a broadly based tax, of course. If it were hypothecated, if it were linked to a particular spending program, and I think there's a lot to be said for linking a VAT to universal health insurance, then I think you would create a constituency for spending discipline in a way that we don't have at the moment. But again, I just ask you to reflect. I can see people shaking their heads. If the country is not ready to even think about a VAT, if that isn't even coming onto the agenda, it seems to me that underlines my initial point, that we aren't scared enough yet to deal with the problem. And if I were a betting man, I'd say that it is going to take an outright fiscal crisis to get this problem seriously addressed. So with that.
Okay, thank you. I saw Bob Reischauer ferociously writing down, so he may be preparing his defense of his B-. We'll see from him if he wants to pop in later. Jim, could we please hear what is going on with your former colleagues on the Hill?
Well, thank you. If at the end of my brief comments here, you kind of scratch your head and say, does he think there's the political will to solve this, or does he not think? The answer is I'm agnostic, and sometimes I think there may be, and sometimes I think there's not. So I put my summary up front there. At the beginning here, before we started, those of us gathering around the speaker's table, as each person came in, we asked them, have you ever seen such a toxic political environment? And each person sitting down said, no, we've never seen anything quite like this. So there was consensus, at least on that, among those on the panels here today, that we've never really seen a toxic environment quite like this. How has it gotten that way? And what can be done about it? Well, I have a whole lecture that I give on how Congress has really gotten to the state that it's in, and I'm not going to give that here today. I think that Charlie Stenholm, in his introductory remarks at the beginning of the session here today, was quite right in saying that at the heart of all this is a problem of the redistricting process. But I'm going to leave that aside. I think that's very much at the heart of it. There's always been politics. I mean, all you have to do is go back to the kinds of things in the 1900s that were written about presidential candidates and the scurrilous things that were written in various yellow sheets that were put out, to know that there's always been politics, and it's never often been not fair, and it's often been not accurate. So it's been there. We have had this in our political system for a long, long time. But we've also found through the years that we found a way to rise above that. Whether you're looking at something like, of course, at the beginning of World War II, when the question of whether the United States should enter the war in Europe or not was quickly put aside by the attack on Pearl Harbor. So Americans have a way of coming together when there's something as catastrophic as that occurs. But even other things that were not as catastrophic as that, the NATO plan, the Marshall Plan, Americans have had a way of rising above that on a partisan and bipartisan way to solve some of these problems. Civil rights legislation would be another example of that. So why has this disappeared today? Why do we not seem to see this? Why do we sit around the table here and say it is the most toxic that we've ever found? There's a lot of things that are going on in Congress, aside from the redistricting process, which is very much at the heart of it, the smaller things. Whether you talk about the amount of time that members of Congress spend a day on fundraising, this is not a comment on Supreme Court rulings, but just the amount of time that members are spending on the fundraising process. The constituent demands. Constituents want members there all the time in their home districts. the family demands that are there, mean that members are socializing much less than they ever did before. I mean, that's one of the things that really struck me between my going to Congress and 25, 22 years later leaving Congress, was how much less socialization takes place between members of Congress today than did then. And I think you can't deny the general societal aspects of what's happening here today. There's a nastier tone out there. There's less respect for authority. There's less respect for people who are in authoritative positions. Maybe that's good sometimes, but sometimes it may not be so good. So I think you have to look at the general society. So the question really is, when is the public going to decide this is their number one priority? Well, you heard David Walker say they have. He's been in 46 states. They have decided it's their number one priority. Now, you heard Clive just say here that it's not their number one priority. So I'm somewhere in between. Sometimes I think it is, and sometimes I think they have come to that conclusion, and sometimes they have not. What I think is really important is what if they do, and when they do, I think eventually they'll have to, what kinds of solutions will the public embrace as a way of resolving this or solving this? Will they be willing to go to fundamental problems that we've heard talk about here today over and over again? For example, the reform of the entitlement system, the reform of the tax structure. Will they be able to go to those kinds of things, or are they going to simply look for the simplistic notions that might solve it? And among those, I would include, freezing discretionary spending, as though somehow that saving less than 1% of the spending over the next 10 years is going to resolve the problem. Eliminating earmarks, another one that's always favored, as though somehow that's going to resolve it. Or when I was chairman of the Foreign Operations Subcommittee, I always heard we'd just get rid of foreign aid. We'd fix all the budget problems that we have in this country. And of course, waste, fraud, and abuse, that's always the favorite. Everybody's for getting rid of waste, fraud, and abuse. We haven't quite figured out how to solve the budget problems on that before. Or will they accept the reality, as I said a moment ago, will they accept the reality that entitlements really, in my opinion, are the heart of the problem? Because I do agree, as David said, I think it's primarily a spending problem that we've got. And if it's primarily a spending problem, it's clearly primarily entitlements that are at the heart of the problem. It's sometimes, when we look, the last panel mentioned for the first time in the discussion here this morning the role of states in this. And I think it's instructive to look at what's been going on in states where I say that, in a sense, in a state like mine, Arizona, or next door in California, the inmates running the asylum. That is, the public has taken control of the process over the last several decades. They've taken control of the process through the initiative process, a legislative initiative, constitutional initiative process, and look what they've got. They've got limitations that you can't increase spending, that you can't increase taxes, and they've added spending in and fixed it at certain rates, and the legislature is not able to do that. Well, in an economic downturn, that, of course, is a recipe for catastrophe. And what does the public do? They wring their hands and they point to the legislators and say, why haven't you fixed this problem? Which, of course, structurally they're not able to fix in many cases. So, will the public accept their role in this? I think the answer is unknown on that. I do see a glimmer of hope. And I'll end kind of on this note. I do see a glimmer of hope in what's happening today on the political scene. There's clearly something, and Norm I think can comment on this better than I can. I'll be interested in his ideas about this. But there's clearly something happening out there politically today. And it isn't just, as was said earlier, it isn't just Massachusetts. There is something that is happening, and there's this mood out there of getting rid of incumbents, people that are in office, and it doesn't matter what their political office is. It's a rise of independence trying to take control and to do something. The question is, what is it that is driving this, and will it be channeled into a constructive force? That's really what we don't know. Will the people who replace, if there is a massive turnover in the Congress this year, will the people who replace them be true reformers, or will they be people who are simply populists looking for the kinds of simple solutions that I was talking about a moment ago? Will they be true reformers, willing to step up to the plate, to be the kind of statesmen we saw at the founding of this republic, and willing to put their fortunes and their lives on the line? That we don't know. But education of the public is clearly at the heart of all of this, and that's what I think much of what this can be, is educating the public about the nature of the problem that we have.
Thanks, Maya. I guess we could say that it all started downhill when Jim Kolbe and Charlie Stenholm left Congress. One little aside to something that Clive said. I actually thought it was quite interesting that when President Obama was asked the other day whether taxes for people making under $250,000 would be off the table on a commission, he said that he is agnostic about that everything is on the table. And there wasn't nearly as much blowback as I might have imagined. And the fact that he was willing to do that and not take the cheap way out itself was encouraging, at least mildly encouraging. I would start with this. Dealing with this problem, much less solving it, would be tough even if we had highly functional politics by American standards. Democracies, and ours especially, are very reluctant to take short-term pain for the if-come-maybe of long-term gain. Elites are much more willing to accept that notion, but even now that's not as true. And that would be the case if we had a real credible and easy path. The difficulty policy-wise now of pivoting swiftly from the need for massive stimulus, deciding when that has to end, and then move as rapidly as we can to major cutbacks to build in fiscal discipline is not to be underestimated. I've tried to come up with an analogy before, and the one that I've come up with is it's like Evel Knievel saying that he is going to take his motorcycle across the Grand Canyon, and he will rev up to 250 miles an hour to do so, but then he has to immediately stop because 100 yards ahead is the Snake River Canyon. And doing that is not easy to do. Now, having said all of that, the fact is that in the past, when we faced really serious problems, we've taken at least credible, if not sweeping action, and managed to keep ourselves from falling into a canyon as deep as the Snake River Canyon. Whether it was Graham-Rudman, an imperfect but still meaningful vehicle, the much maligned but seriously important 1990 budget agreement. It continues to pain me that George Herbert Walker Bush dances away from what I would view as his greatest domestic achievement by far. And the fact is the pay-as-you-go rules that were put into place there really had an impact and had as much to do with moving us towards fiscal balance and surplus as anything else. And we could mention others, but I won't take the time. But we've managed, at least at times, to do this before. Now, you have to be at minimum uneasy because we have to add in the dysfunction that we do have right now. And I would join the chorus here and say that I'm going on 41 years of immersing myself in the politics of Washington and kicking around the halls of Capitol Hill, and I have never seen it this bad. And it's been bad before, going back to the early 1970s and the impeachment of Richard Nixon, and all the way up through the impeachment of Bill Clinton. We've had our times when you could say, gee, it's never been this bad, at least in our lifetimes, but this is worse. And it's not just because of the problems inside Congress. I agree that redistricting is a serious problem, and I'm trying to spend a lot of time now seeing what we can do about it. Here, as in campaign finance, we have a Supreme Court that has no concept of reality and can't be counted on for any help. But it goes beyond redistricting. The Senate doesn't have districts. And the forces, the powerful electromagnets that pull politicians away from the center, that now, for example, have people like Bob Bennett facing a serious primary challenge from the right, that had Chuck Grassley very uneasy about a serious primary challenge from the right, that mean that there's a heavy price to pay if you try to find bipartisan solutions. All exterior and interior issues in Congress make it worse than what we've seen before. And if you layer onto that heavy level of populist anger, the distrust of virtually all institutions and leaders that centers more on government than anything else makes it very difficult. To get meaningful action when you are asking people to accept short-term pain for the outcome maybe of long-term gain requires broad bipartisan leadership consensus. We are 0 for 3. We don't have bipartisanship, we don't have leadership, we don't have consensus. And that, of course, brings us to the surreal quality of our politics this year. It's not just, as David Walker said, that we have 7 co-sponsors of the Greg Conrad Commission voting against their own bill, both to deny President Obama a victory and to preclude the possibility of tax increases being in some kind of commission report. It's also Michael Steele and other Republican leaders trying to kill the health reform package by standing up for a Medicare Bill of Rights that said we will support every dollar of Medicare spending into perpetuity. That does make it a little bit difficult to deal with the issues that everybody here has talked about. When you get the kind of politics that suggests that there is reward that comes from that kind of behavior, and objectively, reward has been coming. The combination of Massachusetts, the gubernatorial elections in New Jersey and Virginia, the departure of people like Evan Bayh from the political process, it doesn't lead to the kind of politics that we would like. So, is there a glimmer of hope, as Jim has suggested? It is a bare glimmer at this point. It requires more than a presidential commission. It requires perhaps enough of a bump in the road that we can finally get to a more meaningful commission that isn't going to have a true action-forcing mechanism, but that will require an up or down vote, that will put people on the record for some kind of a package that can make a difference. And at the same time, I think there is at least a slim chance that we could move to some meaningful tax reform in the next year. One of the most disappointing things for me about the Obama administration and Obama's policy in his first year was that he actually bought onto extending a large number of the Bush tax cuts. I wish we had played a game of brinksmanship and said they're all going to expire. For a minority party now, every incentive, the real power comes from delaying, retarding, and blocking action. But if a blockage of action means that you get the worst case scenario, you actually force people to the table. Forcing them to the table could lead us to something that might include some of my preferences, which would be a replacement of a large portion of the income tax with a value-added tax, or the payroll tax with a carbon tax. Tax things you want to discourage, stop taxing things you want to encourage, and that might also then lead to not just a better tax system, but a better sense of the balance between the revenues that you're bringing in and the government that people want. We may be able to get to at least some semblance of that point in 2011. But the road to get there is rocky because we are seeing a revolt out there. Whether it is a revolt of the center that leads to sensible centrist politics, or a revolt of a radical populist center that could lead to more irrational or destructive politics, the kind of populism that involves protectionism, isolationism, and the trashing of leadership is a very open question right now. And the more we try to focus on it, the more I get a headache.
Good morning. Just a little closer. So I'll do my best. I might disagree with you as much as possible today. Keep our tradition going. So in 1965, you all know the history. In 1965, President Lyndon Johnson embarked on a war on poverty. During the same period, he also increased our involvement in the war in Vietnam. They called this guns and butter. And by 1967, he was standing before Congress saying that he could no longer afford to do both without increasing taxes. In 2001, President Clinton left George Bush a $236 billion surplus. The president decided to cut taxes for the wealthiest Americans, and after 9/11, he increased defense spending even more, getting us into 2 wars. And by 2004, we had $413 billion deficit. Still refusing to raise taxes or cut spending, President Bush added a Medicare prescription drug benefit that we couldn't figure out how to pay for. I like to call this combination guns and caviar. So now this mess is what is President Obama's problem. And the Republicans in Congress have proven that they are perfectly willing to point fingers at him for spending money while they collect checks for their congressional districts and states with great glee, writing letters to ask for more of it. The president can't complain, though. Nobody asked him to take this job. In fact, he worked really hard to get it. And for those people who like to point out that, looking at who created this mess is whining or looking backwards, I like to think of a cartoon I saw during the Bush administration of a little boy. A father goes into his son's room, and the room's trashed, there's clothes and food everywhere, and the father looks sternly at his son, and the boy looks up at him and says, "Dad, let's not play the blame game." But it's important to just remember the context here. I mean, you've heard, and this isn't just a problem of the last few years. We've been getting here with some of the entitlements for a long time. You've heard from the experts about policy. We're going to talk to you about politics and compare it to the policy. I think the politics make the politics look very easy. The truth is that politicians have nothing but negative examples when it comes to dealing with the deficit and long-term debt. See George Bush, 1990, and Democratic Congress in 1994 after taking action with President Clinton's economic program. Both actions were followed by electoral defeats. I spent most of my political career working in the South and the West, places like Georgia, Tennessee, Nevada, Arkansas, Florida. And most of the people that I encountered in those states were small government people with traditional values, and who looked at Washington with a great level of disdain. And they were sort of a pragmatic thriftiness people who sort of take a practical look at this issue of deficits and debt. And they say, well, if I make $40,000 a year and I spend $50,000 a year, that's not really going to work out very well in the long run. I've either got to bring in more money or I've got to cut back my spending. So all the talk about sustainable deficits sort of sounds like what comes out of the wrong end of a male cattle. Instead, I think there's a political reality that's out there when people talk about deficits. It's not just that's the practical reality, but there's a political reality also, which is that they talk about deficits, and when you hear it, you look at the polling says that deficits sort of rank in the third category, the economy being first, jobs and employment being second. That deficits really are a proxy for people feeling like the government is not operating in their favor. And so because the government is not operating in their favor, they're losing their jobs and we're spending money on TARP. They're losing their jobs and we're spending money to bail out the auto companies. They're losing their jobs and there's a stimulus bill that people are saying isn't really working. So now they don't want you to spend money. If you're going to spend money on things that don't help me, then I prefer you just don't spend the money. But that sort of brings the other side of the equation, which is that if you do things that people like and you explain to them there are things people like, then they may ease off the pressure on you spending the money. So I do believe that this deficit issue is not really the driving issue of the American public right now. I think the president, can we fix it? I think the president is doing, I think they understand this in my talks with people in the Obama administration. I do think they understand that this issue of a long-term debt deficit is a problem. I do think they understand that the American public has a certain amount of political energy around this issue in the short term. They're doing what they can to address it in the context of individual policies, and whether that's this, these issues of a bipartisan commission or freezing domestic spending, things that we all can sit around the table and look at and say, well, in the long term, they're not really going to have that big of an impact. They do give the public the impression that the president is starting to take these issues on. So since we're talking about politics here, I will stay in that realm. But we all know that ultimately this is going to be a much bigger issue. It's going to have to deal with entitlement reform, defense spending, taxes, a lot of things that benefit a lot of people, which means that people are going to have to give up things that they like. And that is something politicians never like to do. You don't like taking food out of anyone's mouth. And to do that, there would be a couple of things that are required. Like most people, politicians operate on about 3 impulses: fear, hope, and complacency. So they're afraid they're going to lose their job, they're hopeful they're going to get a job that they want, or they don't want to rock the boat because people seem to be just fine the way things are. Something is going to have to impact that, whether it's an external problem. We had one at 9/11, and I would argue that the president did not capitalize on that moment to really marshal the country to take on any big challenge that would have a long-term impact, other than going into Afghanistan, which I wholeheartedly supported. But what may also happen is that there may be an external challenge to the political system, and we may be seeing that in these Tea Party movements. Now, as a Democrat, I'm not particularly impressed by the politics of the Tea Party movement for the most part, but what I do think is, having lived through, I worked for Bill Clinton in 1992 when he ran for president, and having lived through that campaign and saw the impact that Ross Perot had on deficit politics, there may be a moment, if the Tea Party movement is good for anything, that if they can creatively, constructively make an argument about deficits, they can force politicians who operate out of fear to do something that will have a longer lasting impact. But I'll close with this, that I think ultimately our problems are bigger. In the time that I spent traveling the country until last year, until 2008, what I detected was something different, something much more fundamental. That the American people are very aware, hyperly aware of something that they can't quite find a way to put into words. That the greatness of America is somewhat like sand in someone's hand at the beach, and they feel like it's slipping through their fingers. And they're looking for someone, some political leader, some political force, that will deal honestly with grabbing that sand and putting it all back together. And they feel it not just for themselves, they also feel it for their children even more acutely. He's having a little tough time right now, but John Edwards talked about this. When I worked for Bob Graham, he talked about this. With Two Americas, Bob Graham, who's a much more wholesome figure, talked about this with talking about the One America concept, that people feel as if they're being asked to sacrifice something while other people are getting something. And if you look back to the core rationale behind the Obama candidacy, I don't think it was any particular policy. I don't think it was any particular political bent. It wasn't a return of liberalism to the forefront of America. It was this sense, starting from his 2004 convention speech, that we're all in this together. And that if we were not red states and blue states and black America and white America, but that we could all sort of come together and deal with the core problems that the country is facing. So whether that's energy, whether it's the education system they see failing their children, the competition with China or India or anywhere else in the world that people are really detecting, or the long-term issues of debt and deficit. They want someone who's going to pull the country together to handle these problems. So as a country, I would argue that we're like an athlete or a team in need of going to training camp. But somebody has to explain to us what the end result is. What does the victory party look like when we get out of training camp? And I do actually think, Norm, that if someone marshaled the country, and I think the president did this in 2004, I think he did it in 2008 in his campaign, he started to sketch out a notion that we could deal with these big problems, and I'd be the straight one to talk to you about them. In the last year, I would argue that they have started to talk about component pieces of fixing them without really wrapping it into a kind of a unified theory of what it's all for. And until we get back to the place of what it's all for, we're all going to argue with each other about these small pieces, and I don't think we're going to get very far. To sort of paraphrase Winston Churchill, I have great confidence in America. We tend to do the right thing after we exhaust all the other options. I think we're still exploring some other options, but we're going to get to doing the right thing.
Great. Thank you so much to all the panelists. Really interesting panel. As I was listening to it, it just dawns on me that the theme kind of is that the lessons that are learned are constantly the wrong ones. So we had a no new tax pledge that now both parties have adopted, with Democrats having it a little bit different. It's just no new taxes for anybody less than $250,000. We had, when President Bush was trying to move forward on Social Security reform, the Democrats basically ended up with, we don't like the plan, and instead of coming up with alternatives, we don't want to see the president have a win on this. And we now have Republicans who've said that same thing to President Obama in terms of health care reform. We don't like this plan and we don't want to see him have a win on this and we're not going to play at all. And same thing with the commission. And then we saw sort of, whether you believe this was the motivation or not, under Republicans, there was more of the star of the beast. We cut taxes before we dealt with the budget situation, and now a lot of Republicans look at what's going on with Democrats and say, well, you're feeding the beast. You're trying to create a new health care entitlement, or you're trying to make parts of the stimulus permanent before we fix the budget situation. And unfortunately, it seems like the lesson that each party learns from the other is the one that those of us who are worried about the budget wish we're not the one that we're learned. The other lesson that I've learned is that everybody's done a great job today except for your moderator, and I'm running out of time, so I will not make a question out of that, but I am curious how one turns the tide so that you start having the lessons that reinforce fiscal responsibility, if you want to slip that into your answers from the other folks. One housekeeping thing is lunch is going to start getting served. Can people sort of clear off their tables? And then what I think we'll do is we'll take a couple questions at a time, turn over to the panelists, and then turn over to our keynote speaker. So, yes and yes.
Clive, the United Kingdom will have a deficit in the year ahead with Americans, 13% of GDP. There's an election pending. The general expectation is that the Conservatives can win. How can the UK reduce this massive budget deficit without going after things like healthcare spending, pensions, the issues we've talked about here in the U.S. this morning? Just a further question. Do you think the parliamentary system can address this kind of issue more effectively than the American system with separation of powers and different branches of government?
I'm going to take a second question before we do answers, just so we can get a couple in. Right here. Here you go.
I was just curious if you can comment on any ideas about how to get back to more sociability and interaction among congresspeople.
Oh, please, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Just quickly on Britain and the issue of the, is the parliamentary system better at solving these problems? As you say, Britain has a bigger budget deficit right now than the US, has a colossal fiscal problem. The one advantage, I guess, of the parliamentary system, the British-style parliamentary system, is that you know who to blame. The government, a British politician once said that the British system is an elective dictatorship, which I think is a very accurate characterization. Once you have a government in place, the government can do more or less as it pleases. There are no checks and balances. As long as the government has a parliamentary majority, it can do what it wants to. One government or the other is going to have to solve this problem. And I think neither party has yet come up with a very plausible account of what's going to happen. The fact that so many European countries are in such huge fiscal difficulties, I think, does tell you to subtract a little bit from the credibility that you would otherwise give to the view that the American politics is uniquely broken, and this is a particular kind of American form of paralysis. Much less democratic systems in Europe seem to have even bigger problems in dealing with fiscal difficulties than the US.
On the question of what can be done to bring sociability back to the Congress, I wished I had some really easy or good answers to that, other than to simply repeat the problems that I see there, to make people spend more time with each other, to not be going back to their district, not be spending as much time on fundraising. Jet travel. Before the days of jet travel, people came and they brought their families to Washington and they socialized on the weekends with each other. That doesn't happen today. People go back to their districts. When I first came here, almost all members, not almost all, a lot of members have their families here in Washington. Today it's very rare for anybody with children, for sure, to have their families here in Washington. They keep they're back in the district. So they're just it's a societal thing more than anything else, I think. But I think there are some things that can be done. Leadership can reward on both sides. Leadership can reward people who actually go out and seek solutions that are on a bipartisan basis. And I think the leadership at the very top has to start that with more contacts between speaker and majority leader. Again, we're talking here about the House, which is what I'm more familiar with. But I think the same thing applies over in the Senate as well, as to how the lack of bipartisanship has developed over the years there. So I think all of these things are some little things that might be done, but they're only going to be around the edges. They're only around the margins. I admit that.
Let me give you a few concrete things, recognizing that there's no panacea here, but there are actually a couple of very powerful things I believe that can be done. One, very simply, we should move to a 5-day-a-week schedule in Congress, 3 weeks on and 1 week off. You come in at 9 on Monday morning, you leave at 5 on Friday afternoon or later. If you go 3 weeks on and 1 week off, you've got time to go back to the district and talk to people. But if people are here 5 days a week, 3 weeks, they're going to have a big incentive to move their families here. You're actually going to have some deliberative elements to a policy process. You might have time to read, to think, to do other things. Now, add to that one other element that becomes important. No fundraising during the 3 weeks that you're on. Because what happens now is, if you watch what's going on the floor, if you're walking around the Capitol, you're seeing members stream out of the building and out of their offices to go to the Capitol Hill Club or the Democratic Club or safe houses to make fundraising calls. That's not a very good way to do one's business. The third thing that people are not going to like very much, but it's important, is a much more generous subsidy for housing for members of Congress. They get an absurd $3,000 tax credit. You have to maintain 2 households. You come here without a significant capital base, you simply can't afford decent housing within reasonable proximity to the Capitol if you have kids going to school. And that's not a very popular thing. I'd actually like to see subsidized housing. Take the old Congressional Hotel, which is now an office building, turn it into apartments. You could make them actually, you don't have to heavily subsidize them. You could simply make it a break-even proposition and find other places where you could have people move here. It would make a dramatic difference. You can't demonize people very easily if you're standing next to them at the sidelines of a soccer game where your kids are both playing on opposite teams. But now it's much easier to demonize.
Well, I think there's a bigger issue, which is that both parties now tend to represent almost monolithic districts. So members of Congress don't have as many Republicans in their district. Democrats don't have so many Republicans they have to woo. Republicans don't have so many Democrats. And Norm's sort of the expert on this redistricting issue. But I do think we've got to figure out how to create districts that have more competition.
We'll talk about whether it's stimulus or health care or budget. It's not a very specific thing. We don't come out with big agreements. But the members of Congress so regularly say, we wish we had more time to discuss public policy. So much of what they do really isn't at all connected to the reasons, the interest in public policy that brought them there in the first place. So there are some simple things that I think could hopefully change things. We have time for a few more questions. We'll take one there, and one there.
Yeah, Phil Kiesling, former Secretary of State of Oregon. You've mentioned a major problem and one element to solve it. That's the uncompetitiveness of districts, 80%, not only Congress but state legislative. But you've only mentioned one possible solution, which is redistricting, which if it doesn't happen in 2011, we've got to wait another 10 years. I'm wondering about a second one, and that's abolishing the party nomination primary. We've reached the point now that in a party primary in states, typical turnout is 20 to 25%. That not only means the extremists of both parties are the ones that dominate, but it also means the electorate's about 60 or 65 years old on a medium age. And are we surprised that we get Medicare Part D? Are we surprised that we can't deal with the entitlement programs? Now, California has a proposal to abolish the party primary that's on the ballot in June of 2010. It would copy what Washington State did. And even though someone referenced the inmates running the asylum in the state of California, and we all know about its various dysfunction, is that perhaps a good idea in California that could be part of the solution to get some of the discipline on the fiscal side back into the equation? Because it would, by definition, let independents vote on a complete and equal basis, and top two go to the finals regardless of which party it is.
Interesting. As a political independent, I always feel left out, so that's nice. Right there. Did you have your hand up?
Hi, I'm Barbara Tomar, representing emergency physicians. And I was wondering if you had a notion of how we can reconcile seriously addressing the debt and setting a goal with coming up with some sort of semblance of health reform, which from all that I read of both the bills that passed, was basically not going to, in the vernacular, bend the cost curve much at all.
Question. And then there was one last question. We'll go back there. Sorry to make you walk around more.
At the risk of sounding anti-democratic, I'm going to blame the motivation of this question on a piece I recently read in New York Magazine called "Is Democracy Killing Democracy?" And it argued that we're in fact not a democracy, of course, we're a republic, and that the tension between populism and elitism is sort of off balance in America today. So I wondered if you all could comment on whether or not you see any risks in the emphasis of sort of the strategy to educate the public, a public that we learned earlier today will laugh at you and call you a liar if you say that Medicare is a public option. And in so doing, and emphasizing the need to educate the public, are we letting our leaders off too easy? And do you think there might be something to a strategy of leaders saying, you need to eat your spinach, and might we therefore be able to address this crisis much more quickly?
Great questions. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to ask you all to keep your answers short, maybe pick one.
Let me start with Phil's question and get on my favorite hobby horse, which is, abolishing the party element of a primary would be great. I would like to go for mandatory voting. If you look at the Australian experience, the major impact, where you pay a fine of about $15 if you don't vote, and basically they get about 96 to 97% turnout. You can vote for none of the above. But what Australian politicians of all stripes will tell you is when you know that the game is no longer motivate your base to turn out and scare the crap out of the other side's base so that they don't turn out, instead you know everybody's going to be there, you focus on different issues and you aim at the middle. And in fact, if we had mandatory voting in primaries and in the general election, then an issue like this would be at the forefront instead of same-sex marriage, abortion, or other issues that are designed to get the bases turned out. So it's not going to happen in the near term. We don't like mandatory anything here, but that might do more than anything else to help the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget.
I'll just briefly comment on a couple of them. The idea of mandatory voting is an interesting one, and I think that Norm has hit on something that is certainly true. It would force you to do things other than trying to motivate just your base. It's one of those things that we could talk about. Is it feasible to do in a society like ours where we have never had such a thing as mandatory voting? I'm not sure we've had drafts, so I guess maybe we could make it mandatory. It's going to be very difficult to do. But eliminating the partisanship of primaries, I'm not sure that will have any real impact. In my state, in Arizona, we went to an open primary system, and of course everybody flocked from Republican and Democrat into the middle to its independents so they can vote one way or the other. It does not seem to have made the primaries less virulently partisan than they have been before. You're still trying to motivate those people to vote over here or those people to vote over here, whether they carry the registration or not. So I'm not sure that that's the answer. Having said that, I don't really know what we do have as the answer. In terms of the last question, I'm going to leave the healthcare to somebody else here, but in terms of the last question about are there risks in educating the public, no, I don't think there are risks in educating the public. You still have to do that. Yes, leadership is a key element here. Leaders have to stand up. Elected officials have to stand up and say, this is what we have to do, and I'm willing to stake my political future on this, and if I'm not reelected, so be it. After a while, when I was in Congress, I began to realize there are more important things than getting reelected. It's not a bad thing to come to that conclusion about that. But certainly educating the public, I think, is a key part of all of this. You do need to educate the public. The question is educating them and having them come to the right solutions. But when I stand up, when a politician stands up and says you've got to eat your spinach, you want to give them some hope that the public's going to say, well, I don't like eating that spinach, but I understand what you're telling me and why it's necessary to do so. And that only comes with education.
I'm going to pass. Actually, I have nothing to add to.
Thank you. You're such a good panelist when you have a bad moderator. Thank you. Jamal.
Well, I think I addressed the point of others.
You're both great. So thank you very much. I'm sorry I ran over, and a wonderful panel. Thank you.